I've sung this hymn before. The image of love, love with a capital L is another name for God. That love that will not let me go is more the image of a mother holding me tight in her arms. I rest my weary soul in thee, we sang. But singing this hymn right on the heels of Jacob's story, wrestling in the night with God, I have a new image in my mind. This image of love grappling and refusing to let go even when the opponent is wrestling against God. And speaking of right on the heels, Jacob the heel. Jacob named heel because he's grasping onto the heel of his twin brother. That name Jacob also means he grasps. And Jacob's life story, as I was telling the kids, was all about grasping and grappling and struggling. He kept grasping for things that he wanted, even if it meant being a heel and being a trickster. If we flip back in the story of Genesis to chapter 27, we learn that Jacob grasped for his inheritance that belonged to the firstborn child, to his brother Esau. Jacob tricked him out of his inheritance for a pot of stew, taking advantage of his brother when he was hungry. And then he grasped for the blessing from his father Isaac as Isaac was dying, tricking his blind father into thinking he was Esau. And Esau became so murderously angry that Jacob had to run away from home. And he goes to the land where his grandfather Abraham had come from. And he finds his uncle Laban in that land. And Jacob gives as good as he gets with Laban. Jacob gets tricked into marrying Laban's eldest daughter, Leah, before the one that he really wanted, that was Rachel. Jacob gets even with Laban when he's grasping for some herds of animals of his own rather than just being a shepherd for his father-in-law. And through a bit of trickery, Jacob ends up owning huge herds of sheep and goats and cattle, bigger than his father-in-law's. And Laban gets so fed up with him that Jacob has to leave. And he decides to head home. Actually, God tells him to go back home. And Jacob does that, but it's not clear if it's because he wants to obey God or because he thinks it's a great idea, but maybe more because he's found himself between a rock and a hard place. Some of you may relate to Jacob's trail of broken relationships, or you may at least relate to feelings of being caught between a rock and a hard place. And you too may be able to look back and recall things that got you into that tough spot, things that maybe today you regret. There may be things you said or did because they seemed best for you at the time, but in the end, it left people hurt and angry, even if you didn't intend that. Maybe grasping for things has left you indebted in some way. However much Jacob tried to justify himself, and he could even argue that it was all God's plan, nevertheless, he caused damage along the way, and he couldn't run from it any longer. The time had come to face his past. For most of us, a time of reckoning will come when we find ourselves in the midst of the struggle, in the ring. For wrestlers, before they get in the ring, one of the things they do is to strip down to just a thin wrestling suit. Off come the sweatshirts and sweatpants that have been keeping them warm. Off come the chains or rings that might get entangled. Off comes glasses, hats that might get in the way. And Jacob, too, goes through a process of stripping down before this wrestling match that he has. It's been 20 years since he had seen his brother Esau, since he had left home. But he's worried that maybe Esau continues to carry that grudge. He's worried about how he'll be received. Maybe his brother still wants to kill him. And Jacob's worry turns into real distress, great fear, when he gets that word that Esau isn't just waiting at home for Jacob to arrive, but he's coming out to meet him with his own private army. And Jacob decides that the best strategy is to try to placate his brother with gifts, to sort of cover up the problems with gestures of kindness. So Jacob sends out a series of gifts ahead of him toward Esau: 220 goats, 220 sheep, 30 camels, 30 cattle, 30 donkeys. But he's still terrified. So he sends out his family in series of groups. One wife and her children, the next, the maidservants and their children, and all of his remaining herds and belongings. Jacob slowly strips down all that surrounds him, all that protects him, until the story tells us, so Jacob was left alone. When we face a crossroads, a moment of crisis or a time of reckoning, there's often a process of stripping away our defenses, letting go of our excuses. As hard as it is, it's necessary in order to face a situation clearly, to be honest with ourselves and with others, and even more importantly, only when we take our guard down and get alone are we really able to be honest with God. In the midst of this stripping down process, in the midst of the fear and the dread, Jacob prays to God. And that prayer is recorded in verses 9 to 12 of chapter 32. Jacob prayed, it says he prayed, "The God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, God who told me, go back to your homeland and I'll be good to you. I don't deserve all the love and loyalty you have shown me, Lord. I left this land with only the clothes on my back, and now look at me, blessings galore. And yet now save me, please, from my brother's anger. I'm afraid he will attack me as well as my family, but you yourself, Lord, have promised to be good to me and to bless me with descendants like the sands of the sea, too many to count. Amen." And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. This story raises many questions in our minds, many questions that have been debated in Bible studies over thousands of years, and maybe some of you are fighting the urge to raise your hand and say, but what about, or but how, but who? One of those big questions is a who question. Who is it that wrestles with Jacob that night? It's not immediately certain that it's God. just like those visitors to Abraham and Sarah's camp are initially described as a man, and this person is initially described as a man. People have wondered if perhaps it really was a man. Perhaps it was Esau showing up in the dark of night to wrestle it out with his brother. Or perhaps it was the demons of Jacob's bad deeds and selfish choices, his conniving ways. Or perhaps it was more psychological. Jacob wrestling with his inner demons of fear and selfishness and regret, wrestling with his past. But the fight is very real to Jacob. In fact, as the night draws to a close, Jacob seems to be winning. And for some reason, Jacob's opponent has to leave before the sun rises, so he deliberately throws Jacob's hip out of joint. And yet, even injured and in pain, Jacob hangs on and he refuses to quit. He insists on getting a blessing. And it's at that point that we learn, along with Jacob, I believe, that the wrestler is God. When the one that he's been wrestling with gives him that new name and explains that name, saying, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have wrestled with God and with humans, and you have prevailed." Wrestled with God. Jacob then confirms that he was wrestling with God when he names the place that all this happened, Peniel, which means God's face. I saw God face to face and lived to tell the story, he says. And so we learn that it was God that Jacob was struggling with, and that God initiated this long night of struggle with Jacob. As strange as it seems, God's way of answering Jacob's prayer, his prayer to be saved, was not to reassure him and make more promises to Jacob, but it was to meet Jacob in the struggle, even to cause that struggle. If you've lived long enough, you've probably experienced a time when you felt like you were struggling or wrestling with God. Maybe you even carry the wounds sustained in that struggle. But we are reminded by this story of Jacob that sometimes all that is required of us is to not give up, to persist, and that if we do, eventually these dark nights will bring change and bring victory. Jesus' brother James must have endured struggles, because as he wrote a letter to Christian believers, he wrote saying, "Consider it pure joy, brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work in you, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." I've had that experience. Not just one night, but a season of struggle in many areas of my life, and a struggle in which most of the time all I could do was to hang on and to persevere through the brokenness. And yet out of that struggle, God birthed a new thing. That new thing that led me to prepare to be a pastor. And in the trials, in the struggles, we are shaped. And we take on that name, Israel. Israel isn't just the name that was given to one man, to Jacob, But this story is actually telling us how God's people as a whole were given this name. Israel became the name for the whole community of God's people, the ones who wrestled, struggled with God and with other humans and overcome. It's our story. It's our name. For we too wrestle with God in prayer, in moments of difficulty at the crossroads of our lives, and we too are to hang on to God and refuse to let go. We're not a people of passive faith, but of an active, persistent, persevering faith, willing to strive for heavenly blessings so that we too might see God face to face. Are any of you wondering what happens next? Maybe you want to flip a few pages to see how that story ends. The sun comes up, and Jacob limps away from the fight. But Esau is still coming, getting closer. Jacob can't avoid meeting his brother. And Genesis 33 starts out, Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming with 400 men. He bowed to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him, held him tight and kissed him, and they both wept. And then Jacob said to Esau, "You welcomed me so warmly, it's like seeing God's face." Jacob had wrestled with God and been allowed to see God's face, which enabled him to be reconciled with his brother and to see God's face again in the face of his brother. For most of us, that's exactly where we're going to see God's face, in the face of those who have offered us forgiveness, in the face of those who have offered us kindness and love that we don't deserve. For that is who God is, this God at work wrestling with us. Our story may say that Jacob was given the name Israel because he wrestled with God and prevailed. But in the Hebrew language, when a name or a word ends in El, Israel, it's actually saying something about God. God is El. God is the subject. So when Jacob named the place Peniel, it means God's face. And the name Israel means God wrestles. God struggles and strives. God wrestled Jacob so that Jacob might become the kind of person that God wants him to be, mature and complete and prepared. Who is this God that wrestles with us and wrestles on our behalf? When we think of it, we just want to laugh like the kids did at that thought. It's mind-blowing to think that an all-powerful God who made this whole world and everything in it, that a God who is able to do humanly impossible things, that this God would take on the limitations of a human body to wrestle with a human, and then allow that human to prevail, to win, and then commend him for overcoming God. This is a God who is willing to humble himself in order to come alongside us in times of distress. This is a God who is willing to do what it takes to be present with his children, in the man who wrestled with Jacob and in the man of Jesus of Nazareth. God in Jesus wrestled in prayer on a dark, fear-filled night, sweating drops of blood in that struggle. He persisted, asking God to release him from the suffering that only way to fulfill God's plan. He was willing to be the God who wrestled, who struggled, who suffered, who laid down his life for the world. Jesus is a God who was willing to submit to what appears to be a human victory over his life, being killed on the cross by human hands. He submitted himself to human strength and power so that we might have a way out of broken relationships with God and with others. Jesus himself submitted to death so that we might overcome our fears and find hope and joy and love. This is the God at work in our world and in our lives. This is the God who loves you so much that he is willing to lose in order to bring you back into relationship with God and with others, with your brothers and sisters, so that you might see God's face, that you might see God's face in the face of your neighbor, your brother, your sister, your fellow church member, so that you might have the victory. It's not our victory. It's victory in God, in Jesus. And that is our closing hymn, Victory in Jesus.